Long before the name Australia appeared on any European map, long before sails emerged on the horizon and imperial flags claimed distant shores, this continent already belonged to an ancient human world. It was not empty. It was not waiting to be discovered. It was not a blank space in history. For tens of thousands of years, this land had been home to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples whose presence stretched back roughly 65,000 years, making their cultures among the oldest continuous living cultures on Earth. This first Australia was not one people, one language, or one kingdom. It was a vast and complex human landscape made up of hundreds of distinct groups, often identified today as around 500 nations or clan-based societies, each with its own laws, stories, customs, kinship systems, and sacred ties to country. From the tropical north to the desert interior, from riverlands to coastal plains, these communities shaped lives that were deeply adapted to place. Land was not merely property, it was memory, law, ancestry, identity, and spirit. To belong to land was not the same as owning it. People were part of a living relationship with the world around them. That is what makes the beginning of Australian history so often misunderstood. Many traditional narratives begin with European arrival, as if history started only when outsiders recorded it. But this continent had already been named, sung, traveled, and understood in ways that European maps could not capture. Songlines connected geography with memory. Dreaming traditions linked the present to creation. Social order was maintained not through European-style states, but through systems of law, obligation, ceremony, and custodianship that were no less real for being different. This matters because the entire story of Australia changes depending on where it begins. If it starts with Captain Cook, the continent appears as an opportunity. If it starts with the First Fleet, it appears as an imperial experiment. But if it starts here, with Aboriginal Australia, then everything that follows becomes something else entirely. Not the birth of history, but the collision with a history already ancient, already rooted, already full. So the first Australia was not a colony, not a prison settlement, and not a frontier waiting to be built. It was an old world, complete in its own terms, shaped by people who had survived climate shifts, transformed environments through knowledge and fire practices, and maintained continuity across immense stretches of time. This is the deepest foundation of the continent's story, and that is why the history of Australia should not be told as the sudden rise of a new society from empty land. It should be told as the encounter between empire and an older world. Before Britain, before New Holland, before Sydney, there was country. There were peoples, languages, obligations, ceremonies, and systems of meaning. Australia was not born when Europe arrived. The first Australia had already existed for millennia. Everything that came later would not replace that truth. It would collide with it. Australia changed for the first time not because the land itself became different, but because outsiders began to see it through a radically different lens. European empires did not just travel with ships and trade ambitions. They traveled with maps, categories, and the power to rename what they encountered. That act of naming was never innocent. It was the first step toward possession. The Dutch were the earliest recorded Europeans to reach parts of the continent in the early 17th century. In 1606, Willem Jan Zoon made landfall on the northern coast. Later, in 1642, Abel Tasman expanded European knowledge of the southern region. In time, the name New Holland entered European usage. But what this really meant was not that a new land had come into being. It meant that Europe had begun imposing its own vocabulary onto a place that already contained countless indigenous names, boundaries, and meanings. This is one of the most important turning points in the history of Australia. Before colonization comes perception. Before occupation comes mapping. Before seizure comes definition. Once a land is drawn into the imperial imagination, it is no longer simply where people live. It becomes strategic, measurable, claimable. Coasts become routes, rivers become resources, territory becomes an object. By the 18th century, British and French interest in the region intensified. Then came James Cook in 1770. Surveying the eastern coast, Cook claimed it for Britain under the name New South Wales. That moment has often been framed as discovery in traditional historical storytelling, but from another angle, it was something closer to invention. Not the invention of the land itself, but the invention of a new political meaning for it within the framework of empire. That shift changed everything. A continent that had existed in indigenous systems of belonging was suddenly absorbed into European geopolitical logic. It was no longer only a homeland, it became a projected colony, a strategic prize, a possible extension of imperial power. The French presence in the Pacific also mattered here, because British moves cannot be separated from the fear of rivalry. Australia was entering not just European awareness, but European competition. This part of the story is powerful because it reveals how empires work. They do not begin by building cities, they begin by changing perception. They redraw the mental map first, and once a place is mentally transformed into an imperial asset, physical occupation often follows. So this was the second Australia, not the first Aboriginal continent, but the Australia imagined by Europe, a land charted from the outside. A land renamed, measured, and gradually detached from indigenous meaning in the eyes of foreign powers. Nothing material had yet fully changed across the whole continent, but the future had already begun shifting. Australia was no longer only a place that existed on its own terms. It had become a place being redefined by those who intended, sooner or later, to control it. If the age of exploration was the moment Australia entered the European imagination, then the late 18th century was when Britain turned that idea into machinery. Australia was not first used by the British as a utopian settlement or a grand new society. It was used as a solution to an imperial problem. After losing the American colonies, Britain faced a growing crisis. Its prisons were overcrowded, and its old system of transporting convicts to North America had collapsed. It needed somewhere far away, controllable, and useful. Australia, newly mapped into imperial consciousness, offered exactly that. In 1788, the first fleet arrived, marking the beginning of Britain's penal colony in New South Wales. Under Governor Arthur Phillip, the first settlement was established at Sydney Cove. This event is often treated as the formal start of colonial Australia, and in one sense it was. But it is important to understand what kind of beginning this really was. It was harsh, improvised, unstable, and coercive. This was not a confident civilization expanding smoothly into new land. It was a remote settlement held together by discipline, military authority, rationing, anxiety, and survival. Convicts, marines, administrators, and settlers lived in difficult conditions, cut off from the imperial center and dependent on fragile supply lines. That gives early colonial Australia a strange and revealing character. Its foundation was shaped by punishment, exile, and necessity. Britain did not create this colony because it saw Australia as a future nation. It created it because it needed a dumping ground and a foothold at the edge of the world. In that sense, the British did not discover a destiny in Australia. They repurposed an entire continent for imperial convenience. And yet, this improvised penal outpost began slowly to transform into something larger. More land was occupied, more structures of rule emerged, more people arrived, but disorder remained part of the system. The Rum Rebellion of 1808 exposed how unstable colonial authority could be as military and commercial interests fought over control. Even in its early years, Australia was not simply a colony being built. It was a contested space in which power was still unsettled and the shape of society remained uncertain. This third Australia, then, was a land put to work by empire. No longer merely named from afar, it was now inhabited, administered, and forced into a new political function. The British had moved from seeing the continent to using it, and that use carried consequences far beyond the penal system itself. Because once a colony exists, it does not remain confined to its original purpose. A prison settlement requires land, labor, supplies, security, and expansion. It pushes outward, it develops institutions. It creates its own social tensions and ambitions. What began as a place of exile was already becoming the framework for something more enduring. That is the paradox at the heart of this stage. Australia's colonial beginning was not noble, democratic, or idealistic. It was improvised from imperial failure. But from that flawed and coercive beginning, a new colonial society started to emerge. Australia had now been remade again, from an indigenous continent to a European idea to a functioning instrument of empire. Every story of expansion is also a story of loss, but that truth is often softened in national myths. In Australia, the growth of colonial settlement did not unfold on neutral ground. It came at a devastating human cost, and that cost was borne above all by Aboriginal peoples whose worlds were fractured by disease, violence, displacement, and systems of control. The destruction began not only with guns, but with disease. Smallpox, measles, and other illnesses moved through indigenous communities that had no natural immunity to them. In some regions, populations collapsed with terrifying speed. This is one of the cruelest aspects of colonial history. Societies could be damaged before they even fully understood what was arriving. Epidemics weakened communities, severed continuity, and opened the door to deeper dispossession. Then came the frontier wars. For a long time, these conflicts were often minimized or ignored in older historical narratives, but they were real, widespread, and brutal. As settlers pushed outward, claiming land for farms, livestock, and expansion, Aboriginal communities fought back to defend country. These were not isolated misunderstandings. They were sustained struggles over land, survival, and sovereignty. The spread of fences, stock routes, and settlement patterns transformed the environment and made conflict almost inevitable. Figures such as penal stand at the center of this stage because they show that Indigenous peoples were not passive victims of history. They resisted, they adapted, they fought. At the same time, figures like Bungaree reveal another side of the colonial frontier: mediation, accommodation, and the search for survival within a world being reordered by force. Between resistance and adaptation, Aboriginal people were pushed into impossible choices. As colonial rule strengthened, it moved beyond conquest into administration. Protection boards, missions, and reserves emerged as tools of control. Aboriginal people were often separated from traditional lands and placed under systems meant to regulate movement, work, family life, and identity. These policies were not merely bureaucratic. They disrupted the deep connections between people, land, law, and ancestry that had sustained Indigenous societies for millennia. This is why the settlement of Australia cannot honestly be told only as progress. Roads, farms, towns, and institutions did not arise in an empty landscape. They emerged through dispossession. The growth of colonial order depended on the breaking of older orders. What settlers described as development often meant the shrinking of Indigenous worlds. So this was another remaking of Australia, and perhaps the most painful one. The continent was becoming a settler society, but only by pushing the first Australia to the margins. Wealth, stability, and expansion were real, but they were never cost-free. They were built on taken land, broken communities, and historical wounds that would continue shaping the nation long after the frontier itself had faded. To understand Australia deeply, this part of the story cannot be treated as a side note. It is central. It explains why modern debates about memory, justice, reconciliation, and national identity remain so powerful. Because the making of settler Australia was also the unmaking, or attempted unmaking, of Indigenous Australia. And the nation that followed would carry that contradiction into every future version of itself. By the mid-19th century, Australia entered another transformation. The continent was no longer just a penal outpost at the edge of empire. It was becoming a place of opportunity, ambition, and political self-assertion. The catalyst was gold. The gold rush, beginning in 1851, reshaped colonial Australia with astonishing speed. Population surged as migrants arrived from Britain, Europe, China, and beyond. New towns sprang up almost overnight. Wealth expanded, mobility increased. A society once defined largely by punishment and distance now pulsed with energy, risk, and possibility. Australia's image began to change. It was no longer only a place Britain sent people to. It was a place people chose to come to. But prosperity did not create harmony. The goldfields were also sites of frustration, inequality, and tension with colonial authorities. This erupted most famously at Eureka Stockade in 1854. Militarily, it was limited. Symbolically, it became enormous. Eureka came to represent a demand for political voice, fairness, and dignity against arbitrary power. Whether remembered as rebellion, protest, or proto-democratic struggle, It helped shape a popular Australian tradition of skepticism toward authority and sympathy for the ordinary person challenging injustice. That same emotional landscape helps explain the cultural power of the bushranger, especially Ned Kelly. Legally, Kelly was a criminal. In legend, he became something else, a rebel figure, part outlaw and part folk hero, associated with defiance, endurance, and hostility to an unfair system. Australia was building not only institutions but myths, and some of its strongest myths came from conflict with power rather than obedience to it. This period also marked a deeper political maturation. The colonies grew more self-confident, more economically connected, and increasingly conscious of belonging to a larger shared future. In 1901, Federation united the colonies into the Commonwealth of Australia. This was a major turning point. Australia ceased to be merely a collection of separate colonial units and became a nation-state in constitutional form. But the birth of that nation carried a profound contradiction. Even as Australia embraced democratic institutions and a distinct identity, it also formalized exclusion through the White Australia policy. The new nation defined itself not only by unity and self-government, but by racial boundaries. That is what makes this stage so historically revealing. Australia's national identity emerged through both aspiration and exclusion, through dreams of fairness for some and barriers against others. So this fifth Australia was dynamic, self-aware, and increasingly national. It was forged in goldfields, rebellion, migration, folklore, and constitutional change. It was a society no longer content merely to function as an imperial possession. It wanted to define itself. Yet from the beginning, the identity it created was selective. The question of who counted as fully Australian was never neutral. This is what makes the making of the nation so compelling. It was not a simple rise from colony to country. It was a negotiation between freedom and control, openness and exclusion, democracy and hierarchy. Australia was being remade once again, this time not only by empire from above, but by social energy from within. The result was a nation coming into view, powerful and confident, but already marked by the tensions that would follow it into the modern age. In the 20th century, Australia was drawn fully into global history. No longer just a distant settler society within the British Empire, it became a nation tested by war, reshaped by migration, and increasingly forced to reconsider the foundations of its own story. This was the stage at which Australia moved from colonial extension to modern statehood. The First World War played a decisive role in that shift. The Anzac legend, especially through the Gallipoli campaign, became central to Australia's national memory. Militarily, Gallipoli was a failure. Symbolically, it became something much larger, a story of endurance, sacrifice, comradeship, and national character. In Australian memory, it marked a moment when the country began to see itself not just as British, but as distinct. A nation could emerge through loss as much as victory. Between the wars, Australia experienced hardship through the Great Depression, yet this period also produced enduring symbols of national life. Qantas reflected technological ambition and growing internal connection across vast distances. Don Bradman became more than a cricketer. He became a cultural icon, a source of pride in difficult times, proof that national identity could be built not only in battle, but also in shared civilian achievement. The Second World War transformed Australia even more sharply. The bombing of Darwin brought war directly to Australian soil, ending the illusion that distance guaranteed safety. At the same time, Australia's strategic orientation shifted. Reliance on Britain weakened, and alliance with the United States grew more central. This was a profound geopolitical turning point. Australia was no longer simply a southern branch of the British world. It was becoming a Pacific nation with its own strategic calculations. After the war came another remaking. Immigration expanded dramatically, helping to build a more diverse and dynamic society. Over time, Australia moved away from the narrow racial assumptions of its earlier national framework. Modern Australia became increasingly multicultural, urban, and globally engaged. Symbols such as the Sydney Opera House and the 2000 Sydney Olympics projected confidence, sophistication, and international visibility. Yet modernity did not erase the past. One of the most important features of contemporary Australia has been the growing effort to confront the legacy of colonization and the treatment of Indigenous peoples. Reconciliation, however incomplete, signals something crucial. Australia is no longer trying only to celebrate itself. It is also trying to understand itself. That means facing uncomfortable truths about land, violence, exclusion, and silence. So this sixth Australia is wealthy, highly developed, and globally recognizable. But its deepest modern story is not just success, it is self-examination. The country has become more than an imperial outpost, more than a settler colony, more than a racially exclusive federation. It is now a society still negotiating what it means to belong to a land with such layered histories. And that is what makes the broader arc of Australian history so compelling. Australia was not born once. It was remade repeatedly, first as an ancient indigenous continent, then as a European invention, then as a penal colony, then as a settler society, then as a nation, and finally as a modern state, still wrestling with memory. Each collision created a new version of Australia. And the story is not finished yet.